HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dispatches from Puerto Nowhere, an American story of assimilation and erasure, by Robert Lopez. Read by Lee Osorio. What I don't know about my family is almost everything. I don't know when or why my grandfather left Puerto Rico, although I can make assumptions about jobs and opportunity and the nebulous better way of life that can be applied to countless immigrants. I don't know anything about his family, if he had brothers or sisters, who his parents were, or what they did for a living. I don't know if he left anyone behind on the island to come to Brooklyn. I never asked questions, and no one in my family told those kinds of stories. I know less about my grandmother. I do know she was born in New York City, but I know nothing of her parents. I remember hearing that one was from Spain and the other from Cuba, but I don't know which was which or why they immigrated to the U.S. Nothing was passed down. Not the language, not the food or music, or the family history. Everything was erased. I don't know what my father knew about his heritage. I don't know if he ever met his grandparents or knew anything about them. I don't know if he ever went to Puerto Rico or heard stories about his father's life there. The story my father told our family was that he understood his parents' Spanish, but would respond in English when he was a kid growing up in Brooklyn. I never saw any evidence that my father understood Spanish. An immigrant is a person who has come to live permanently in a foreign country. If you stand in exactly the right spot in Brooklyn Heights with a good pair of binoculars, you can't come close to seeing Puerto Rico. The same is true if you stand on high ground in Miami, if there is high ground in Miami. What in this life is permanent when everything is foreign? I pity the poor immigrant when his gladness comes to pass, said Bob Dylan. Cultural assimilation is when individuals or groups of differing ethnic heritage are absorbed into the dominant culture of a society. The process involves taking on the traits of the dominant culture to such a degree that the assimilating group becomes socially indistinguishable from other members of the society. Here in the United States, they are whitewashed. It's rare for a minority group to replace its previous cultural practices completely, particularly during the last 50 years. But before that, it happened all the time. Puerto Rico has been part of the United States since Woodrow Wilson signed the Jones-Shafroth Act in 1917. But Puerto Rico has never really been part of the United States, and no one thinks of Puerto Rico as part of the United States. So I think of my grandfather as an immigrant. I go back and forth with what I've lost through erasure and what I've gained by assimilation, and what it all means. The back and forth is like a tennis rally, and how different shots behave on the court. Mario's flat backhand will rush through the air and stay low, whereas the topspin Teddy puts on his forehand will have the ball kangaroo past shoulder level. Wayne's backhand slice skids off the ground and eats you up if you're not ready for it. In Brooklyn, I live in the American melting pot exemplified by the diverse tennis community of which I'm a part. Most everyone has a history, or at least a mythology, the stories we tell each other and ourselves, idealized narratives that we can talk about during changeovers and water breaks. Even I play the game, but it's a hollowed-out mythology when I tell it, and almost entirely a fiction. I sometimes tell them that my grandfather was a house painter or guitarist for Tito Puente, that he toured the country in Latin America until it was time to get married and raise children. But I can also say that he was a longshoreman or boxer who had 2 or 3 families and was an absentee father and grandfather, which was why my own father never learned Spanish, and neither did I. My grandmother never taught me any Spanish, but said I should learn in school. The example she provided to underscore the importance of learning Spanish had to do with her experience riding a subway and overhearing 2 men planning some sort of crime. She found a cop on the platform and ratted the would-be criminals out, and this was why I should learn the language. My grandmother was earnest in this advice. There was no other reason to learn or speak Spanish. Dispatch from the Unaffiliated. My name is Robert Lopez, and I look like my name is Robert Lopez. This has only recently occurred to me, that I look Latino. Before this realization, I had never spent time thinking about how others perceive me. I grew up surrounded by white people, and never thought of myself as other. My father never said that we're Puerto Rican, so this means some people will consider us second-class citizens, and will be subjected to scorn and prejudice. No one ever told me that teachers and coaches and employers and policemen might treat me differently. I didn't think of myself as white, per se, so perhaps the most apt categorization would be unaffiliated. That's me, Robert Lopez, unaffiliated. I had to ask friends a pointed question when I started writing this book. What do you see when you look at me? And they all said that I look Latino, that they don't think of me as white and never have. A tennis partner from years ago named Jason, a black Panamanian, expressed surprise when I told him I was Puerto Rican. He said he thought I was black. I'd heard this before. A close friend named Shelley relayed an anecdote about a party we'd attended and how years later, someone else at that party referenced the black man Shelley was with. Shelley didn't know what this woman was talking about until she realized the woman meant me. Playing pickup basketball in the early 90s, a tough Irish football player who was also good at round ball said he was going to smother my black ass as he volunteered to guard me. I lit him up that day. Dispatch from 1970s Long Island. The first time someone called me a spick was during recess, or after school in the playground, or in the park across the street from my house on Long Island. I was in shirt sleeves and it was hot, or I had on a heavy winter coat with a ski hat and gloves and boots because it had snowed overnight and we could see our breath in the frigid winter cold. I liked the thought of the word spick hanging frozen in the air, the vapors of which are exhaled and linger for an unnatural period of time, like in a cartoon, until they disappear. That's how I've experienced most of what's happened to me, from childhood on, as a series of vapors, exhalations, and disappearances. These vapors go back even further. Maybe the starting point was 1904, the year U.S. engineers began work on the Panama Canal, and New York City unveiled its first underground subway line. That same year, over 1,000 miles away on an island in the Caribbean Sea, my grandfather, Sixto Lopez, was born. Maybe his mother gave birth to him on a Sunday during a turbulent spring rainstorm. The dirt road through town was washed out and impassable. That's why the one doctor they knew of couldn't assist with the delivery. It was Sixto's abuelita who wiped the sweat from his mother's brow, extolled her to push through the pain, and gently received him as he writhed and wailed and took his first shallow breaths, glowing pink and gelatinous with blood and afterbirth. He took his final shallow breaths in a bathtub in Brooklyn in November 1987. I was a sophomore in high school, my sister an 8th grader. When we got home from school, our mother's car was in the driveway, which was unusual. Normally she'd have been at work, but her presence didn't set off any sort of alarm when I first saw her, and I wasn't concerned or worried. She broke the news to us in the foyer as soon as we entered the house, and I remember trying to cry as an appropriate response. I knew that was what you were supposed to do when your grandfather died. I'd seen it on television and in the movies, though I hadn't known anyone who died up to that point in my life, so I had no practical experience. About 2 or 3 seconds into this futile attempt at weeping, I stopped, realizing it was ridiculous. Dispatch from a Winter Tableau. One probably wouldn't imagine a winter tableau replete with snowdrifts and icicles as a realistic setting where one person calls another a spick for the first time. I've always liked winter best and still do. I like the cold. I like that night starts early and lasts forever. I like walking to the supermarket without working up a sweat. I wonder how many half-Ricans prefer winter to summer. Back when children wore snowsuits come December and January, the ones that had the mittens sewn into the sleeves, the winters were majestic all over New York. There were blizzards every other weekend, and drifts would bury the cars parked in the street and the trees lining the sidewalks. It seemed as if we would never see the cars again, and if school ever did reopen, we'd have to use wooden tennis rackets as makeshift snowshoes and tramp through the snow to get there. My mother and father took photographs of the cars, of my sister and me, all buried in content and whited out on our lawn outside of our Levitt house in the middle of a particularly conservative and culturally bankrupt part of the country known as Long Island. The Long Island of the 70s and 80s was a different sort of conservatism than what we see today. Back then, it was about money and greed and racism and law and order and the military. Maybe it wasn't entirely different. Perhaps the differences lay in a particular kind of small-mindedness, a suburban ignorance when it came to matters of sex, drugs, freedom of expression, individuality. There wasn't anything Christian about this conservatism, not overtly. But it was somewhat puritanical and devoid of any meaningful culture. My sister and I would go out to the backyard and build snow forts. We did this in matching snowsuits, designed to keep us safe and dry and warm, which were bulky and ridiculous and didn't allow for any sort of athletic maneuver. You couldn't fight in them, for instance, but you could build a fort, and after the fort was built, you could do almost anything, such as build another fort right next to it. I have no memory of what, if anything, we did inside the forts. The first time someone called me a spick, I was 6 or 9 or 11 years old. The last time someone called me a spick was probably in high school, and most likely a term of endearment. Getting called a spick didn't bother me more than, say, getting called hyperactive by my childhood friend Joey, who lived across the street. I felt obligated to chase Joey down after he called me hyperactive one day in the park. His evasive maneuvers were ineffective, and I caught up to him and threw 1 or 2 haymakers that put him on the ground. We were maybe 7 or 8, and Joey was a head taller than me. Joey called me hyperactive because I always wanted to keep playing hockey or baseball or football or basketball when everyone else wanted to quit and go hang out on the playground. If anyone called me any kind of name when I was a kid, I was likely to throw down, because I was both hyperactive and fearless back then. Same was true if someone made a mother or father or sister joke, regardless of the content. Spick didn't cut deeper, but it had a provocative power I couldn't quite understand. I don't think my sister was ever called a spick, regardless of the weather. I don't think girls were called spicks in the 1980s. Maybe they never were. Dispatch from Stony Brook University's Department of Corrections. This past week in class, one of my grad students mentioned that she was called a spick in Brockton, Massachusetts in the 2010s. Dispatch from the Moon. My father came home later that evening, having gone to Brooklyn to help his mother earlier in the day. I don't know what he did there, but I imagine it had to involve making arrangements, visiting a funeral parlor, maybe cleaning up the mess left behind when someone dies in the house. I was nervous about seeing him, as I didn't know what I should do or say, and I didn't know how my father would react to losing his father. My father was always the strongest man I'd ever known, but I didn't know if that strength would extend to grief. His arms were the size of my legs then, and even his wrists were thick and muscled. It'd been only recently that I could keep up with him in a foot race, even though I was fast. And he was fearless. Always the first to stand up to trouble or rush to someone's defense, particularly his family's. But I didn't know if something like that mattered. It seemed unrelated, beside the point. I didn't know how any of it was supposed to work. We rushed over to console him when he came through the door, and he was stoic and strong, as always. Then he walked into the kitchen and hung his head over the oil burner that was tucked into a wall that separated the kitchen from the living room. It was the posture of someone crying. Maybe for the first time in his life. My father was almost out of eyeshot of his children, and I went into the living room to give him even more privacy. I don't know if I did it for him or me. As I type this sentence, I am 47 years old, the same age as my father when his father died. All of it seems unbelievable, and as far away as the moon. My grandfather had been suffering from prostate cancer that probably occurred and reoccurred, and by the end of his life he had grown thin and frail. I can't recall if it was that night or sometime in the next week, during the wake and funeral, that my father said if the paramedics had attempted to resuscitate him, his chest would have caved in. Or that they did try to resuscitate him, and his chest did cave in. No iron spike can pierce a human heart as icily as a period in the right place, said Isaac Babel. I had no emotional connection to my grandfather, and I can't say that I felt any sort of affection for him, neither while he was alive nor after he died. Like most children, I suppose I was somewhat afraid of older people, regardless of relation. His thick accent also kept me at arm's length, as I had a hard time understanding him. I had even less affection for my grandmother, his wife. For years, I thought this indicated there was something wrong with me, but I never spent that much time thinking about it. Maybe this was a byproduct of assimilation. Maybe if they'd insisted my father speak Spanish, and his children speak Spanish, and spoke Spanish to all of us, and talked about Puerto Rico and what it's like to live there as a second-class U.S. citizen, and educated us about traditions and customs and food and music, then something like a bond could have been forged. Maybe we could have made tostones and maduros on El Dia de Reyes while listening to Jose Feliciano singing Feliz Navidad. Or maybe nothing would have fostered a connection with them. Dispatch from Krakow. For years, I've been misquoting the late Polish poet Czesław Miłosz without knowing that Miłosz is the one I've been misquoting. I've done this, I'm sure, because I heard someone else misquote Miłosz. I'm pretty sure this person did so without attribution as well. How far back it goes is unknowable, of course, but it's akin to a literary telephone game that is entirely without consequence or the least bit interesting. What I've been saying is this. When a writer is born into a family, it's the end of the family. I preface this statement with the inarguable, a writer once said. I used to think Flannery O'Connor said this about writers and families, as it sounds like something she would have said. It isn't scholarly or academic to say, a writer once said, but it gets the point across to students. I trot this misquote out whenever I'm trying to get students to risk more on the page, whenever I see them tap dance around potentially interesting and dangerous material. I use the Miłosz quote to give them license to let it fly, to destroy themselves and their families. I employ any number of quotes and misquotes when I teach fiction and nonfiction writing to students. Babel, Hemingway, Faulkner, Chekhov, Didion, Pritchett, Hannah, Shakespeare, O'Connor, Morrison, Borges, Stengel, Berra, Ray Charles, a writer, etc. The actual quote attributed to Miłosz is, when a writer is born into a family, the family is finished. I like the misquote better. There's a finality to the misquote that feels apocalyptic, whereas the actual quote sounds softer. One can finish a coffee table or a deck. One lover can ask another, "Did you finish?" and it would be considerate. A diamond is finished, as are countless other precious gemstones and earthly items. A family finished can mean they've attained the pinnacle of human achievement. No reason to go any further, to go forth and continue this mindless multiplying, for we have birthed a writer. Dispatch from one way of looking at it. I am not here to destroy or finish my family. The Lopez side of my family, in most ways one can measure, was finished long ago. Dispatch from the Caribbean. Puerto Rico is that tiny island in the Caribbean where the beaches are immaculate and the women are beautiful and the food is free and everyone makes love and drinks rum and plays baseball all day long and into the night. Puerto Rico is that tiny island in the Caribbean that is split between two countries, and on the other side is Haiti, and there are earthquakes and hurricanes and poverty and corruption and dictators and juntas and movie stars adopting orphans. Puerto Rico is that tiny island in the Caribbean where it's the third or fourth world, and there's no running water or electricity, and only state-run television and radio, and there's no internet, but everyone can read and write, and all the cars are from the 1950s, and they make the best cigars, and had a dictator who lived and ruled over everyone for 114 years. Puerto Rico is that tiny island in the Caribbean where they speak French or Dutch or English, and invented reggae and practice voodoo, and they're always bracing for hurricanes and marauding Europeans, and everyone is beautiful, and they make love and play baseball and drink rum all day long and into the night. Dispatch from 407 Washington Avenue. I decided to watch the Puerto Rican Day Parade, and then I decided to make a day of it. I put on some Tito Puente and made a complicated sandwich that included sliced tomatoes, avocado, and sprouts. I hoped I would learn or feel something as I watched the Puerto Rican Day Parade on television in Brooklyn, while the Puerto Ricans paraded up Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. At the same time in Paris, Rafael Nadal of Mallorca, Spain, was winning the French Open for the 12th time in his distinguished career. Nadal is a supernatural force on clay, a slower surface which suits his unrelenting style, where he retrieves ball after ball and sends it back into his opponent's court with incredible depth and spin until he decides he's had enough of such foolishness and flattens out a screaming down-the-line winner to end the point, the game, the set, the match, the championship. Nadal was on NBC, and the parade was on ABC, and I went back and forth so I wouldn't miss anything. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, said John Keats. Dispatch from Highland Park. The day before the parade, I played tennis with Jorge, Can, and Sunil in Highland Park because we couldn't get a court at Fort Greene Park, and then we couldn't get on the court at the Cage in Bed-Stuy. There was some sort of event for kids wearing green t-shirts and holding miniature tennis rackets. One must wake very early on the weekends, 6:30 or so, and stand in a long line with other tennis crazies to secure a court at Fort Greene Park. It's entirely objectionable and uncivilized. None of the four of us were willing to do this. I am never willing, but others freely volunteer on a rotating basis, and I often take full advantage of their insanity. After the selfish children at the Cage body-blocked us from playing, I drove our quorum of doubles players to Highland Park in my girlfriend's car, a small red Fiat you can lift off the ground with minimal effort. Jorge is Guatemalan, Can Turkish, Sunil British by way of India. Jorge called it a clown car, as he was the last to get in, sitting in the front passenger side, legs folded up under his chin. A coalition rainbow in an Italian clown car. Where's Fellini when you need him? We saw dozens of Puerto Rican flags on cars and on poles and in storefronts on the drive through Bushwick to get to Highland. No one mentioned any of the flags. Not the Turk, not the Brit, or the Guatemalan. So when I said we saw them, I'm not sure that's true. I saw them. This was the 62nd National Puerto Rican Day Parade, but the first one I watched on television. It's obvious I've never attended a Puerto Rican Day Parade, nor did my father, I'm pretty sure. Like me, he was never much of a Puerto Rican, didn't claim or display any pride whatsoever in being one. I've never felt a compulsion to parade around as a flag-waving member of the PR tribe because why would I? To be fair, I've never been ashamed of being Puerto Rican either. Dispatch from as long as I'm here. I've never felt a compulsion to parade around for any reason. Dispatch from the end of the line. The Lopez side of my family ended on its own, and it had nothing to do with any writer. I suppose while I am still living, and while my sister is likewise, this particular Lopez family has not quite ended, not technically. But as my sister took her husband's name, and I have no children presently, and will not father any in the future, this Lopez line will die with me. Dispatch from Puerto Nowhere. According to a Morning Consult New York Times poll conducted in 2017 in the wake of Hurricane Maria, almost half of Americans didn't realize Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Puerto Ricans living on the island cannot vote for president and do not have congressional representation. One must fill out an international slip to mail a package from the mainland to Puerto Rico. Since 1898, Congress has debated 101 bills related to citizenship in Puerto Rico and enacted 11 overlapping citizenship laws with all kinds of crazy provisions and caveats, including the law prohibiting foreign flag ships from delivering cargo to Puerto Rico. To this day, it isn't clear if Puerto Rican citizens enjoy the same equal protection guarantees under the 14th Amendment. Puerto Ricans pay the same payroll taxes as mainland Americans, but don't get the same Social Security or Medicaid benefits. Puerto Rico is the land that democratic theory forgot, said Luis Fuentes Rower, Indiana University law professor. Dispatch from the Land of Opportunity. I'm trying to rethink all that's happened to me and determine how my ethnicity might have played a part. I don't know what else my last name has cost me. Maybe jobs, opportunities, relationships. I think about what I might have gained, too. That maybe I get paid to read and teach at universities in part because my last name is Lopez. Dispatch from the political extreme. In January 2022, federal prosecutors filed seditious conspiracy charges against the leader of the far-right organization, the Oath Keepers, and 10 other individuals for their role in the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. It was one of the very rare instances in which this law, aimed at protecting the government from attacks, has been applied in U.S. history. However rare these charges are levied, they were brought against Puerto Ricans throughout the 20th century, including when 4 armed Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire on members of the U.S. Congress in 1954. Also, when 2 Puerto Rican nationalists tried to assassinate President Truman in 1950. According to Maria Luisa Paul in the Washington Post, this militancy began in the 1930s, 3 decades after the United States acquired Puerto Rico from Spain, when Pedro Albizu Campos, a graduate from Harvard University, became president of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. He believed that the island's colonial situation caused the material and moral misery of his people, and that the only way to redeem this besieged group was through insurrection. Dispatch from Mayaguez. Sixto turns 12 tomorrow, and his mother is making pernil and mofongo and arroz con gandules, and for dessert there will be sliced pineapple. He doesn't know that his mother has been saving for a guitar and will present it to him after supper when they are alone and the rest of the household has gone to bed. He wants to try playing the guitar that night, but she tells him to wait till morning so as not to wake anyone. The next day,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?